Why did everyone turn cold after one party? I only laughed when his best friend got a little too close. It was harmless fun, wasn't it? I never thought one joke about real men handling it would cost me my marriage, my friends, and my reputation. I'm Isolde Vance, and I have always believed that a good relationship is built on trust, freedom, and the ability to have fun without constantly worrying about what your partner thinks, which is why I never understood why Nathan got so tense whenever I spent time with his best friend Garrett, because Garrett has always been nothing but friendly and warm to me, and I thought Nathan should be happy that his wife and his closest friend got along so well instead of making everything into some kind of competition or jealousy game that existed only in his head. It was a Friday night in late April, and Nathan and I had plans to meet Garrett and a few other friends at this rooftop bar downtown that had become our usual spot over the past few months. A place with dim lighting, a DJ booth on the floor below that sent bass vibrations up through the metal grating, and a smoking patio that overlooked the city lights. And I was excited because I had been stuck in back-to-back event planning meetings all week, and I really needed to unwind and feel like myself again, instead of just being Nathan's quiet, obedient wife who never did anything spontaneous or interesting. We arrived around 10:30 and the bar was already crowded with people laughing, drinking and dancing, and I spotted Garrett right away on the smoking patio, leaning against the railing with a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other. And when he saw me, he broke into this huge grin and waved me over. So I told Nathan I would be right back and headed outside while he went to get us drinks from the bar. The air on the patio smelled like smoke and spilled beer, and the metal floor grating was sticky under my heels, but I didn't care because Garrett always made me feel seen and appreciated in a way that Nathan sometimes forgot to do. And when I reached him, he immediately pulled me into a side hug and told me I looked amazing, which made me smile because Nathan hadn't said anything about my outfit all evening, even though I had spent over an hour getting ready. Garrett offered me a drag from his cigarette, and I took it even though I don't usually smoke, and we stood there talking and laughing about work and mutual friends while his hand rested casually on my lower back, and I didn't think anything of it, because Garrett has always been a touchy person, the kind of guy who hugs everyone and puts his arm around people when he talks, and I have never been the type to make a big deal out of innocent physical contact between friends. We were out there for maybe 10 minutes, and at some point, Garrett leaned in close and whispered something funny about Nathan's boring job in IT. Something about how Nathan spent his whole life staring at spreadsheets and error logs while the rest of us actually lived. And I laughed because it was true and because Garrett had this way of saying things that made even mean jokes sound playful and harmless. And then I saw Nathan standing inside by the glass door, holding 2 drinks and watching us with this tight expression on his face that I recognized immediately as his jealous, insecure look. I waved him over and Garrett clapped him on the shoulder when he stepped outside, making some joke about how Nathan was lucky to have a wife who was cool enough to hang out with his friends without being uptight. And Nathan just handed me my drink without saying anything and stood there looking uncomfortable, and I could feel the tension radiating off him, even though he was trying to act normal. After a few more minutes, Garrett said he was going back inside to order another round, and he squeezed my shoulder before he left. And I noticed a crumpled cocktail napkin sitting on the ledge near my purse with a phone number scribbled on it, and a little winking emoji, and I assumed it was from some random guy who had been out there earlier, so I didn't think much of it and just shoved it into my coat pocket without really looking. Nathan and I went back inside and joined the group at a corner booth with ripped vinyl seats that had seen better days, and everyone was in a good mood, drinking and talking and making plans for the summer. But Nathan was quiet and kept checking his phone, and I could tell he was in one of his moods where he overthinks everything and turns a fun night into some kind of emotional drama that no one else can see or understand. Around midnight, Garrett ordered a round of shots for the table, and everyone cheered and clinked glasses, and I ended up sitting between Garrett and Nathan because that was the only space left. And Garrett kept making jokes and touching my arm or shoulder to emphasize his points, and I laughed along because he was funny and charming, and honestly it felt good to be around someone who wasn't constantly analyzing every little thing I did. Nathan's phone buzzed on the table, and I saw a text preview from his sister Mira asking if he was okay, and he picked up the phone quickly and didn't reply. And I rolled my eyes because, of course, Mira was checking in on him like he was some kind of victim who needed rescuing, when in reality he was just sitting in a bar with his wife and friends having a perfectly normal evening. We stayed until around 1 in the morning, and by the time we left, I was tipsy and happy and ready to go home and fall asleep. But Nathan was silent during the walk back to our apartment, and I could feel the weight of whatever he was thinking pressing down on the space between us, and I knew he was going to bring up Garrett the second we got inside. Sure enough, as soon as we walked into our living room and I kicked off my heels, Nathan asked me what Garrett had said to me on the smoking patio, and I told him it was just a joke about his job and nothing important. But Nathan kept pushing and asking why Garrett's hand was on my back and why I was laughing so much. And I felt my patience snap because I was tired, and I didn't want to spend the rest of the night defending myself for having a good time with a friend. I told Nathan he was imagining things, that Garrett was just affectionate, and that was how he was with everyone, and that real men didn't get jealous over nothing. And Nathan's face went pale, and he just stared at me for a long moment before he said he was going to bed, and I said fine, and went to the bathroom to wash my face and get ready for sleep. When I came out, Nathan was already lying on his side of the bed with his back to me, and I climbed in and turned off the light. And I assumed that would be the end of it because Nathan never stayed mad for long, and I figured by morning he would realize he had overreacted and we would go back to normal. The next morning I woke up to find Nathan already awake and sitting on the couch in the living room, staring at his phone with this distant, thoughtful expression. And I made coffee and acted cheerful because I wanted to show him that I wasn't going to let his jealousy ruin my mood, and I kissed his cheek and told him I had a work event that evening and would be home late, and he just nodded and said okay without really looking at me. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, and as I was leaving I noticed Nathan standing by the closet, holding the crumpled cocktail napkin I had shoved into my pocket the night before, and he was staring at the phone number and the winking emoji with this unreadable look on his face. And I felt a flicker of annoyance because I knew he was going to make a big deal out of something that meant absolutely nothing. I didn't say anything, just walked out the door and headed to work, and I told myself that Nathan needed to grow up and learn to trust me, because if he couldn't handle me having male friends and enjoying myself at a bar, then maybe we had bigger problems than I thought. But I pushed that idea away because I didn't want to admit that anything was actually wrong. The week after the rooftop bar incident passed in a strange, uncomfortable silence that settled over our apartment like a heavy fog, and Nathan barely spoke to me except to ask practical questions about bills or schedules, and I told myself he was just being dramatic and would get over it eventually because that was what he always did. But this time something felt different in the way he looked at me, or rather the way he didn't look at me, as if he was seeing through me to something else entirely that I couldn't quite understand. I had a coffee meeting scheduled with Jenna Park on Tuesday morning at the cafe in our office tower lobby, one of those quick check-ins we did before big planning meetings to make sure we were on the same page about client expectations and vendor contracts. And I was looking forward to it because Jenna was usually easy to talk to and I needed a distraction from the tension at home. But when I arrived at the cafe and saw her sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around her cup, I noticed immediately that she seemed distant and uncomfortable in a way that was completely unlike her usual warm, professional demeanor. I sat down across from her and ordered a latte, and we made small talk about the upcoming corporate event we were coordinating. But there was this awkward pause in the conversation where Jenna stirred her coffee slowly and seemed to be choosing her words very carefully. And then she said in a quiet voice that a few people at the last work mixer had noticed me and Garrett getting close on the dance floor. And she said it in that careful, diplomatic way that people use when they are trying to tell you something is wrong without actually saying it directly. I felt my face flush with irritation because I couldn't believe people were gossiping about me at work over something so harmless. And I laughed and told Jenna that people were too uptight and needed to learn how to have fun without turning everything into some kind of scandal. And I said Garrett was just Nathan's friend, and we were all just dancing and having a good time like normal adults do, but Jenna didn't smile back and she just nodded slowly and changed the subject to the vendor contracts. And I could tell she didn't believe me or didn't want to push the issue further. And that made me even more annoyed because I felt like everyone was suddenly treating me like I had done something wrong when I hadn't done anything except enjoy myself at a party. After the meeting, I went back to my desk and tried to focus on work, but I kept thinking about Jenna's comment and wondering who had been talking about me and what exactly they had seen. And I felt this creeping sense of frustration that Nathan's insecurity was now spreading to my professional life and making people question my behavior when there was nothing to question. That evening, Nathan texted me that he was going to the gym to meet his sister Mira. And I felt a spike of irritation because I knew Mira had never liked me and probably spent every conversation with Nathan trying to convince him that I was a terrible wife. And I texted back a short okay and went out with a few friends from work to blow off steam, and I made sure to post a few photos on social media of us laughing and having drinks because I wanted Nathan to see that I wasn't going to let his jealousy control my life or make me feel guilty for having fun. What I didn't know at the time was that Nathan was sitting in the gym locker room with Mira after her spin class, and she was asking him how things were at home, and Nathan was telling her about the rooftop bar incident and the cocktail napkin with Garrett's number. And Mira's face was getting harder and more serious with every detail. And she was telling Nathan that he needed to start documenting everything, taking screenshots of texts, saving photos, writing down dates and places, because she had seen this pattern before in HR cases at her company, and she knew how quickly things could escalate and how easily the truth could get twisted if there was no evidence to back it up. Nathan apparently asked her if he was overreacting, and Mira told him no, that what I was doing was not normal and not okay, and that he needed to protect himself before things got worse, and I had no idea that this conversation was happening, or that Nathan was already starting to build a case against me in his mind, because I still believed that he would calm down and realize he was being ridiculous, and we would go back to the way things were before. On Wednesday evening, I came home late from work and found Nathan sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, and I glanced over his shoulder as I walked past and saw that he had a browser tab open to some kind of cloud storage site, and I asked him what he was working on, and he said just organizing some files. And I didn't think much of it because Nathan was always organizing something, spreadsheets or photos or documents, and I went to the bedroom to change clothes and check my phone. I had a text from Garrett asking if I wanted to join him and some friends at the rooftop bar again on Thursday night. And I hesitated for a moment because I knew Nathan would be upset. But then I thought about how I shouldn't have to give up my social life just because my husband couldn't handle his own insecurity, so I texted back that I would be there and that Nathan would probably come too, and Garrett sent back a thumbs-up emoji and a joke about how he would try not to make Nathan jealous this time, and I laughed and put my phone away. Thursday night, we went back to the rooftop bar, and I had convinced Nathan to come along because I wanted to prove to him that there was nothing going on and that he could see for himself that Garrett and I were just friends. But the evening went badly almost from the start because Garrett was already drunk when we arrived, loud and draped over the back of the booth, and he insisted that I sit next to him instead of next to Nathan, and I did because I didn't want to make a scene or seem like I was avoiding him. We ordered drinks and Garrett kept making jokes and touching my arm to emphasize his points, and at one point I felt his hand on my knee under the table, and I didn't move it away immediately because I didn't want to embarrass him or make things awkward in front of everyone, and I told myself it was just a drunk mistake and didn't mean anything. But when I glanced across the table, I saw Nathan staring at Garrett's hand with his jaw clenched tight, and I saw Kyle, one of our mutual friends, glance at Nathan and then quickly look away with this uncomfortable expression on his face. The walk home from the bar that night was silent and tense, and halfway there, Nathan finally asked me why I let Garrett touch me like that. And I felt my temper flare because I was tired of being interrogated and made to feel guilty for things that weren't my fault. And I told Nathan that Garrett was just drunk and didn't mean anything by it, and that Nathan was embarrassing me in front of our friends by making a scene over nothing. Nathan said he wasn't making a scene, he was just uncomfortable, and I snapped back that real men didn't make a scene over nothing, and that if he couldn't handle me having male friends, then maybe he was too insecure to be in a relationship with someone like me. And as soon as the words left my mouth, I saw Nathan's face go completely blank. And he didn't say another word for the rest of the walk home. And when we got inside, he went straight to the couch and lay down without even changing his clothes. And I went to the bedroom alone and told myself he would get over it by morning. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Kyle that said, "Hey man, I don't want to get involved, but last night was weird. You okay?" And I realized with a sinking feeling that the text wasn't meant for me. It was meant for Nathan, and Kyle must have sent it to the wrong person by accident, and I quickly deleted it before Nathan could see it. But the damage was already done because I knew that our friends were starting to notice and starting to take sides, and I felt a creeping sense of panic that things were spiraling out of my control. Friday night arrived faster than I expected, and Garrett had texted our group chat earlier in the day saying he wanted everyone to meet at the rooftop bar again for drinks and dancing, and I could feel Nathan's reluctance when I told him we should go because I knew he was still upset about Thursday night. But I also knew that if we didn't go, it would look like we were having problems, and I didn't want our friends to think there was anything wrong with our marriage, so I convinced Nathan by telling him it would be fun and that he needed to stop being so serious all the time and just relax and enjoy himself for once. We arrived at the bar around 9 in the evening, and the place was packed with people celebrating the end of the work week, and the bass from the DJ booth below was thumping up through the floor so hard I could feel it in my chest. And Garrett was already at our usual corner booth with the ripped vinyl seats, surrounded by Kyle and 3 other friends. And he had clearly been drinking for a while because his eyes were glassy and his movements were loose and exaggerated in that way drunk people move when they think they are being charming but are actually just being sloppy. Garrett saw us coming and stood up with his arms spread wide, and he pulled me into a hug that lasted a few seconds too long, and I felt his hands slide down to my waist and linger there, and when I pulled back I saw Nathan standing a few feet away with his phone in his hand, and this carefully neutral expression on his face that I had learned meant he was angry, but trying not to show it. We all squeezed into the booth, and somehow I ended up sitting between Garrett and Nathan again. And Garrett immediately ordered a round of shots for the table, and everyone cheered and raised their glasses, and I drank mine quickly because I wanted to feel loose and happy and not think about the tension radiating off Nathan beside me. And Garrett kept leaning close to me to tell jokes and stories, and his arm was draped over the back of the booth so his fingers kept brushing my shoulder. And I leaned into him slightly because it felt good to be close to someone who wasn't constantly judging me or making me feel like I had to walk on eggshells around him. About an hour into the night, Garrett suddenly stood up and announced in a loud voice that he wanted to make a toast, and he was swaying slightly as he raised his glass, and everyone at the table went quiet and looked up at him. And I felt a flutter of nervousness in my stomach because I could tell from the look on his face that he was about to say something that would either be hilarious or completely inappropriate. And with Garrett, it was always hard to predict which way it would go. He cleared his throat dramatically and said that Nathan was the luckiest guy in the entire bar, maybe the luckiest guy in the entire city, because he had a wife who was way too hot and way too fun for him. And everyone laughed nervously, and I felt my face get warm, but I smiled because I didn't want to seem uptight or like I couldn't take a joke. And then Garrett added that Nathan should stop being so jealous and possessive and just let me have a good time, because real women need real men who can handle them. And the table went completely silent for a moment, and I saw Kyle exchange an uncomfortable glance with the guy sitting next to him. I knew I should have said something to shut it down, to tell Garrett that he was drunk and being inappropriate, but instead I found myself clinking my glass against his and saying exactly, "Thank you. Someone finally gets it. Real men don't freak out over nothing," and I said it loud enough for everyone to hear, and I saw Nathan's face go pale and tight, and he set his drink down on the table very carefully and stood up without saying a word and walked outside to the smoking patio, and no one followed him. And I told myself he was just being dramatic and oversensitive like always, and I stayed at the table and kept drinking and laughing with Garrett and the others. but there was this uncomfortable energy in the air now that I couldn't quite shake, and I noticed that Kyle wasn't laughing anymore and kept glancing toward the door where Nathan had disappeared. The weekend passed in a cold, silent standoff at home, and Nathan barely looked at me. And on Sunday afternoon, his parents were hosting a small family barbecue at their house in the suburbs. And I knew Nathan didn't want me to come, but I insisted because I wasn't going to let him exclude me from family events just because he was in a bad mood. And when we arrived at his parents' backyard, I could feel the tension immediately because Nathan's father, Robert, was standing at the grill with his arms crossed and this stern, disapproving expression on his face. And Nathan's sister Mira was sitting at the picnic table watching me with cold, assessing eyes. And I felt like I was walking into some kind of intervention or ambush. Garrett showed up about an hour later with his girlfriend Becca, and I was surprised to see him because I didn't know he had been invited. But apparently he and Nathan had been friends for so long that he was considered part of the extended family. And Garrett was already tipsy when he arrived, and he greeted me with another too long hug that I could feel Robert watching from across the yard. And Becca looked exhausted and uncomfortable, and she barely said hello to anyone before sitting down at the far end of the picnic table by herself. The afternoon was going relatively smoothly until Garrett decided he wanted to make another toast, and he grabbed a beer and stood up at the picnic table and tapped his bottle with a fork to get everyone's attention. And I felt my stomach drop because I knew whatever he was about to say was not going to go over well with Nathan's family. But I also felt this strange thrill of defiance because I was tired of being treated like I was the problem when all I was doing was being friendly and social. Garrett raised his beer and said in a loud, slurred voice that Nathan was too serious and needed to lighten up, and that I deserved a guy who could take a joke and not get all bent out of shape every time his wife had a little fun. And he looked directly at me and winked, and I felt everyone's eyes on me, and I knew I should have stayed quiet or changed the subject, but instead I laughed and reached over and touched Garrett's arm and said thank you. Exactly. Someone who finally understands. And I saw Nathan's mother sitting nearby with her hand over her mouth and this stricken, horrified look on her face, and I saw Robert turn off the grill and walk into the house without saying a word. And Mira stood up and walked over to Nathan and pulled him aside to the side yard. And I knew in that moment that I had crossed some kind of line that I couldn't uncross, but I was too proud and too angry to admit it. The rest of the barbecue was a disaster, with people making awkward small talk and avoiding eye contact with me, and Nathan didn't speak to me at all. And when we finally left and got home that evening, Nathan told me quietly that my behavior at his parents' house was hurtful and disrespectful, and I told him he was making a big deal out of nothing and that his family was too traditional and judgmental. And I said if he couldn't handle me having fun and being myself, then maybe we weren't compatible. And Nathan just stared at me for a long moment and then picked up his pillow from the bed and walked to the couch. And I didn't stop him because I was tired of fighting and tired of feeling like the bad guy when all I had done was refuse to let his insecurity control my life. Monday morning, I woke up alone in our bed with a dull headache and the uncomfortable awareness that Nathan had spent the entire night on the couch. And when I walked into the living room, I found him already awake and dressed for work, sitting on the edge of the couch cushions with his back straight and his hands folded in his lap, like he was waiting for something. And his face had this distant, closed-off expression that I had never seen before, not even during our worst arguments. I tried to act normal and asked him if he wanted coffee, and he said no thank you in this polite, formal tone that made my skin prickle with unease, and I asked him if he was going to keep punishing me for having friends and having fun. And he looked at me for a long moment and said very quietly that he wasn't punishing me. He just needed space to think. And then he picked up his work bag and left the apartment without kissing me goodbye or even looking back. And I stood there in the kitchen feeling this strange mixture of anger and confusion because I couldn't understand why he was being so dramatic about something that was clearly not a big deal. I went to work and tried to focus on the event planning projects piling up on my desk, but I kept checking my phone to see if Nathan had texted me, and he hadn't. And that silence felt heavier and more ominous than any argument we had ever had. And I found myself getting angrier as the day went on because I felt like I was being made to feel guilty for something that wasn't my fault. And I convinced myself that Nathan was trying to manipulate me by withdrawing and making me chase after him and apologize for things I hadn't done wrong. That afternoon, I called my mother Diane and told her that Nathan and I were having problems, and I explained that he was being jealous and controlling about my friendship with Garrett, and I said Nathan didn't like me having male friends and was trying to isolate me from my social circle, and my mother listened quietly and then asked me in her careful, measured teacher voice if I had considered Nathan's feelings and whether maybe my behavior was making him uncomfortable, and I felt a flash of betrayal because I had expected her to take my side automatically. And I told her she didn't understand the situation and that Nathan was the one with the problem, not me, and I hung up feeling frustrated and misunderstood. What I didn't know was that on Tuesday afternoon, Nathan's sister Mira was running errands and stopped at the pharmacy to pick up a prescription. And while she was standing in the queue waiting to pay, she ran into Becca, Garrett's girlfriend, and Becca looked exhausted and sad, with dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't been sleeping. And Mira asked her if everything was okay, and Becca hesitated for a moment and then said quietly that she had broken up with Garrett over the weekend. Mira asked why, and Becca looked around to make sure no one was listening and then said in a low, tired voice that Garrett had been obsessed with me for months, that he bragged to her about how I let him get away with anything and how I was so much more fun and exciting than she was, and that he had told Becca she was boring and uptight compared to me, and Becca said she finally couldn't take it anymore after watching Garrett humiliate Nathan at the family barbecue while I laughed and encouraged it. And she said it made her sick to watch, and she realized Garrett was never going to change as long as I kept feeding into his behavior. Mira asked Becca if she would be willing to talk to Nathan and tell him what she had just told her, and Becca nodded and said yes, that Nathan deserved to know the truth, and Mira thanked her, and they exchanged phone numbers, and I had no idea that this conversation had happened, or that the people around me were starting to compare notes and piece together a version of events that was very different from the story I had been telling myself. On Wednesday evening, Nathan came home late from work, and I heard him talking quietly on his phone in the parking garage stairwell before he came upstairs, and when he walked through the door, he had this calm, focused energy that was completely different from the hurt, confused person he had been just a few days earlier, and I asked him where he had been, and he said he had some errands to take care of, and I asked what kind of errands, and he said just things he needed to handle, and his tone was so even and final that I didn't push further, but I felt this creeping sense of unease because it seemed like Nathan was planning something, and I didn't know what it was. I noticed that he had moved more of his clothes into the guest room, and when I asked him about it, he said it was just easier for now, and I accused him of being manipulative and trying to make me feel bad, and he didn't argue or defend himself. He just looked at me with this steady, measuring gaze and said he wasn't trying to make me feel anything. He was just doing what he needed to do, and then he went into the guest room and closed the door, and I heard the lock click, and that small sound felt like a door closing on something much bigger than just a bedroom. Thursday morning, my mother called me and said she wanted me to come over to her house so we could talk, and I drove to her place in the suburbs feeling defensive and irritated because I knew she was going to lecture me about my marriage. And when I sat down at her kitchen table, she asked me very directly if I had been inappropriate with Garrett, and I felt my face flush with anger, and I told her that Garrett was just Nathan's friend, and we were all just having fun, and that Nathan was being jealous and insecure. And my mother looked at me with this sad, disappointed expression and said that she had heard from a neighbor who had been at the barbecue that I had publicly supported Garrett when he humiliated Nathan in front of his family, and she asked me if that was true. And I said people were exaggerating and taking things out of context, and my mother said quietly that she wasn't taking sides, but she was worried about me. And I felt tears of frustration prick my eyes, and I told her she was taking Nathan's side just like everyone else, and I left her house feeling angry and alone and convinced that everyone was conspiring against me. Friday evening, Mira showed up at our apartment unannounced and asked if she could talk to both Nathan and me together, and I felt my stomach tighten with anxiety because I knew Mira had never liked me, and this was probably going to be some kind of confrontation. And we all sat down in the living room, and Mira said in a calm, professional voice that she had spoken to Becca and that Becca had told her some things about Garrett's behavior and my encouragement of it, and I immediately went on the defensive and said that Becca was jealous and bitter because Garrett had broken up with her, and Mira said actually Becca broke up with Garrett, and she said Becca was willing to talk to Nathan directly if he wanted to hear what she had to say. I laughed and said this was ridiculous, that everyone was making a huge deal out of nothing, that Garrett was just a flirt and I was just being friendly, and Mira turned to Nathan and said very quietly, "You don't have to live like this." And I felt a surge of rage, and I told Mira to get out of our apartment and to stop trying to destroy my marriage, and Mira stood up and walked to the door, but before she left, she handed Nathan a business card with something written on the back, and she said, "Call me when you're ready." And then she left. And Nathan sat there holding the card and staring at it, and I demanded to know what was on it, and Nathan said it was just a phone number, and he put the card in his pocket and went to the guest room without saying anything else. That night I lay awake in our bed alone, staring at the ceiling and feeling this growing sense of panic that things were slipping out of my control. And I told myself that Nathan was just being dramatic and that he would calm down eventually and realize he was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something had shifted, and that the dynamic between us had changed in a way I didn't fully understand yet. Saturday morning, I woke up early to find Nathan already awake and sitting on the apartment balcony with his tablet in his lap, and the sun was just starting to come up over the city, painting the sky in shades of pale orange and pink. And when I walked outside to see what he was doing, he quickly closed whatever he had been looking at and set the tablet face down on the small metal table next to him, and I asked him what he was working on, and he said just organizing some files. And there was something about the careful, deliberate way he said it that made me feel like he was hiding something important from me. He went inside without saying anything else, and I followed him, and watched as he poured himself a cup of coffee and left it on the kitchen counter, then poured a second cup and took it with him to the guest room. And I realized with a sinking feeling that he hadn't poured the second cup for me. He had poured the first cup for me and taken his own. And that small gesture felt like a rejection that cut deeper than any argument we had ever had. And I stood there staring at the coffee cup he had left behind and feeling this strange mixture of anger and fear that I couldn't quite name. Sunday afternoon, Nathan told me he had some errands to run, and he left the apartment carrying a slim folder that was labelled on the spine with the word utilities. But when I had glanced at it earlier in the week, I noticed it was much thicker than the usual bills and statements we kept in our filing cabinet, and I asked him what kind of errands, and he said just things he needed to take care of. And I asked if I could come with him, and he said no, this was something he needed to do alone, and he left before I could ask any more questions. He was gone for almost 2 hours, and when he came back, the folder was no longer in his hands, and he seemed calmer and more centered than he had been in weeks. And I asked him where he had been, and he said he had some meetings and took care of some business, and I felt my frustration building because he was being so vague and distant, and I couldn't get him to tell me what was going on. And when I pushed harder, he just looked at me with this steady, unreadable expression and said I would understand soon enough. And then he went to the guest room and closed the door. Monday evening, I tried to start a conversation about working on our marriage and going to couples therapy, because I thought maybe if we had a neutral third party to help us communicate, then Nathan would realize he was overreacting and we could get back to normal. And I sat down next to him on the couch and told him I thought we should try to fix things. And he looked at me for a long moment and then said very quietly that he had thought about it a lot over the past few weeks and that he had decided he was going to handle things properly. I asked him what he meant by properly, and he said I would know soon. And I felt a chill run down my spine because there was something final and resolute in his voice that I had never heard before. And I asked him if he was planning to leave me, and he said he wasn't planning to discuss it right now, but that I should expect to hear from him in the near future. And I felt panic rising in my chest, and I accused him of being cryptic and playing games, and I said, if he had something to say, he should just say it instead of dragging this out and making me guess. But Nathan didn't argue or defend himself. He just stood up and walked to the guest room, and I heard the lock click shut behind him. and that sound echoed in the silent apartment like the final note of a song I didn't want to end. Tuesday afternoon, my mother called again and said she had been thinking about our conversation from the previous week, and she said she wanted to understand what was really happening between Nathan and me, and I could hear the worry in her voice, and I repeated the same story I had been telling everyone, that Nathan was jealous and controlling and couldn't handle me having male friends. But this time my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears, and my mother was quiet for a moment, and then she said very gently that she had spoken to Nathan's mother at church, and that Nathan's mother was very upset about what had happened at the barbecue. And she said it sounded like there were two very different versions of events, and she was having trouble understanding which one was true. I felt a surge of anger and betrayal because I realized that Nathan's family was talking to my family behind my back, and I told my mother that everyone was exaggerating and taking Nathan's side without hearing my perspective. And my mother said she wasn't taking sides. She was just worried about me and wanted to make sure I was being honest with myself about my behavior. And I told her I had to go and hung up the phone, and I sat on the couch feeling isolated and defensive, and increasingly aware that the narrative I had been building in my head was starting to crumble under the weight of other people's observations. Wednesday morning I woke up to find that Nathan had already left for work, and when I went to the closet to get dressed, I noticed that more of his clothes were missing, and I checked the guest room and saw that he had moved several boxes of personal items in there, books and photos and small mementos that used to be scattered around our shared bedroom. And it looked like he was slowly packing up his life and separating it from mine, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me because I realized he was serious about whatever he was planning. I went to work, but I couldn't focus, and I kept checking my phone to see if Nathan had texted, and he hadn't, and I found myself scrolling through old photos of us from happier times, back when things were simple and easy, and he used to look at me with love and admiration instead of this cold, distant assessment that made me feel like a stranger in my own marriage. Thursday evening, when Nathan came home from work, I was waiting for him in the living room, and I told him I knew something was going on and that he needed to tell me what he was planning, and he set his bag down by the door and looked at me with an expression that was both sad and resolute. And he said very calmly that he had consulted with professionals over the past few weeks and that he was going to handle our situation properly and legally. And he said I should expect to hear from him very soon about next steps. And I felt my hands start to shake, and I demanded to know what he meant by legally. And I asked if he was planning to divorce me, and he said he wasn't going to discuss the details with me right now, but that everything would be made clear in due time. And he said the most important thing I needed to understand was that he had made his decision, and it was final, and there was nothing I could say or do to change his mind. I started to cry and told him he was being cruel and unfair, and I said we could fix this if he would just talk to me and stop shutting me out. And Nathan's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. And he said this wasn't about cruelty or punishment. This was about him protecting himself and doing what was necessary. And then he told me he was going to stay with his sister for the weekend and that I should use that time to think about everything that had happened. And he picked up a packed bag I hadn't noticed by the door and walked out of the apartment, and I stood there in the empty living room feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. And for the first time since this whole situation started, I felt genuinely afraid of what was coming next. Friday evening, I called Garrett in a panic, and I told him that Nathan was acting strange and distant and had mentioned handling things legally, and I asked Garrett if Nathan had said anything to him about divorce or separation. And Garrett laughed and said Nathan was probably just bluffing and trying to scare me, and he said Nathan didn't have the guts to actually leave, and that I shouldn't worry about it. But his words didn't comfort me the way they usually did. And after I hung up, I went to Nathan's side of the closet and saw that nearly half of his clothes were gone. And I realized with a sinking feeling that Garrett was wrong and that Nathan was not bluffing at all. Monday morning, I decided to surprise Nathan at his office with lunch because I thought maybe if I showed up and acted normal and loving, then he would remember why we got married in the first place and reconsider whatever he was planning. So I ordered takeout from his favorite restaurant and drove to the office tower where he worked. And I texted him that I was downstairs in the lobby and wanted to see him, and he replied almost immediately with just 2 words, "I know," which seemed strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The lobby was busy with people coming and going, colleagues and clients and delivery workers, and I stood near the security desk holding the takeout bag and trying to look casual and confident even though my heart was pounding. And then I saw Nathan step out of the elevator with Mira beside him, and they were both dressed professionally and walking with this calm, purposeful energy that made me feel uneasy. And I waved and smiled, but Nathan's expression didn't change at all. Before I could walk over to him, a woman in a dark business suit approached me and asked if I was Isolde Vance, and I said yes, confused. And she handed me a large manila envelope and said in a clear, professional voice, "You've been served." And then she turned and walked away. And I stood there frozen with the envelope in my hands and the takeout bag dangling from my wrist, and I could feel people in the lobby glancing at me and then quickly looking away.